Imagine the vast, blistering expanse of the Caribbean Sea in the year 1715. If you were to pull back the lens of history and look down from the clouds, tracing the deep blue water past the scattered, jagged chain of islands stretching from Cuba all the way down to Trinidad, you would witness a world on fire. Zoom in on the lawless, chaotic port of Nassau in the Bahamas, where dozens of heavily armed pirate sloops sit anchored in the shallow harbor, their towering wooden masts looking like a dense forest of stripped trees against the skyline. Pan south across the churning water to the infamous Port Royal, Jamaica, a place universally condemned as the wickedest city on earth, where the brothels and taverns literally outnumber the churches by 20 to 1. Drift further east to the sprawling, brutal sugar plantations of Barbados, where endless fields of tall, green cane stretch for miles under a punishing, relentless tropical sun. Finally, sweep your gaze west to the Spanish Main, the heavily fortified coastline of Central and South America, where massive galleons loaded to the brim with Peruvian silver crawl desperately through waters infested with apex predators. Every single one of these locations, the pirate havens, the naval strongholds, the colonial plantations, and the merchant shipping lanes, is bound together by a single, inescapable common denominator. It is not stolen gold, it is not iron cannons, it is not even the ships themselves. It is rum. It was the exact same dark, burning liquid that kept thousands of desperate sailors from dying of agonizing dehydration on months-long ocean voyages. It was the exact same chemical courage that allowed uneducated, abused men to draw their cutlasses and charge headfirst into a blinding wall of cannon fire. And it was the exact same toxic substance that systematically mutated highly disciplined maritime crews into raging, uncontrollable animals who burned entire coastal towns to ash without a second thought. Rum did not merely fuel the golden age of piracy. It mechanically, economically, and psychologically engineered it. And by the time this terrifying era was finally brought to a violent end, rum had left behind a permanent, catastrophic trail of blood, madness, and empire that stretched across the entire Atlantic world. Today, we are completely stripping away the comedic, romanticized Hollywood myths. We are not talking about lovable rogues stumbling around a beach. We are going to examine the brutal, unvarnished history of how a cheap, toxic agricultural waste product from the Caribbean sugar plantations became the deadliest, most valuable, and most destructive drink in maritime history. Before we uncork the darkest, most brutal liquid history of the golden age of piracy, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, letting us know which part of the world you are sailing in from today. Welcome to the Data Info. Let's set sail. Chapter 1. The Hellbroth of the Caribbean. To deeply understand how rum completely conquered the pirate world, you must first understand the brutal, blood-soaked economic reality of the Caribbean in the 1600s. Because rum did not begin its life as a romanticized pirate beverage. It started as literal, highly problematic industrial garbage. When the massive colonizing empires of Europe, specifically England, France, Spain, and the Netherlands, arrived in the Caribbean, they realized the tropical climate and rich soil were absolutely perfect for cultivating a crop that would change global economics forever: sugarcane. In 17th-century Europe, refined white sugar was an extreme luxury. It was a status symbol for royalty, vastly more expensive than most rare spices, and the global demand was exploding exponentially every single year. Driven by insatiable greed, the colonial powers effectively clear-cut the jungles and transformed the entire Caribbean basin, Barbados, Jamaica, Martinique, Guadeloupe, Antigua, into a sprawling, interconnected network of massive sugar factories. But the aggressive industrial process of crushing sugarcane, boiling the raw juice in massive copper vats, and refining it into crystallized sugar produces a staggering amount of highly viscous, dark, sticky leftover liquid. This runoff is known as molasses. In the early decades of the sugar boom, The wealthy plantation owners had absolutely no idea what to do with this molasses. They had massive mountains of the stuff piling up, and it was a logistical nightmare. It was far too heavy and bulky to ship all the way back across the Atlantic to Europe for any kind of profit. It attracted massive, suffocating swarms of tropical insects. It rotted and fermented violently in the sweltering Caribbean heat, creating a stench that blanketed the islands. Most planters considered it highly toxic garbage, frequently feeding it to farm animals, or simply ordering their workers to dump tens of thousands of gallons of it directly into the ocean just to be rid of it. Then, someone, and historians still fiercely debate exactly who and when, made a brilliant, highly destructive chemical discovery. They realized that if you took this rotting, discarded molasses, mixed it with water, allowed it to naturally ferment in the oppressive tropical heat, and then ran the resulting sludge through a crude copper distillation still, you produced concentrated alcohol. The earliest versions of this distilled liquor were completely unrefined, highly volatile, and absolutely terrifying to consume. It was a harsh, burning chemical that tore the lining of the throat and hit the human bloodstream with the devastating kinetic force of a cannonball. The exhausted, brutally abused plantation workers in Barbados who first consumed it gave it a highly accurate, terrifying nickname, Kill Devil. They called it this because the liquor was so exceptionally harsh, so hot, and so completely hellish that drinking a simple cup of it felt like physically fighting Satan himself. A European visitor to the island of Barbados in the year 1651 recorded a journal entry describing the local drink as a hot, hellish, and terrible liquor. Another historical account from the exact same period stated that this new spirit was made from the foul skimmings of the sugar boiling pots, and that it was corrosive enough to literally strip the paint off the hull of a wooden ship. But this primitive rum possessed one singular, overwhelming economic advantage that guaranteed it would conquer the world. It was incredibly, unbelievably cheap. The primary raw material, molasses, was effectively free industrial waste. The actual distillation process was fast and required almost no sophisticated, expensive equipment. You did not have to delicately age it in specialized oak barrels for years in dark, temperature-controlled cellars like fine French wine or cognac. You could go from raw, rotting molasses to highly potent, drinkable spirits in a matter of days. And in the brutal, unforgiving environment of the Caribbean, where clean, drinkable water was incredibly scarce, and imported European beer and wine spoiled almost instantly in the intense tropical humidity, having a massive, endless supply of cheap, high-proof alcohol was not a recreational luxury. It was an absolute tool of biological survival. This is the exact point where modern popular culture entirely misses the reality of the era. When people think about pirates and rum, they picture it purely as a recreational party drink. But the reality was rooted in grim, terrifying maritime logistics. Fresh water was the single greatest vulnerability of the entire Age of Sail. A massive wooden warship carrying 100 to 300 men required enormous, staggering quantities of fresh water to survive a transatlantic crossing. But in the 17th and 18th centuries, there was no refrigeration, no chemical water purification, and absolutely no understanding of microbiology. Water was stored deep in the suffocatingly hot, dark hold of the ship in massive wooden casks. Within mere weeks of leaving port, this stored water turned into a biological nightmare. It became a sickly, pale green. Thick, gelatinous algae bloomed on the surface. Deadly bacteria multiplied exponentially in the dark. The water became slimy, foul-smelling, and genuinely, lethally dangerous to consume. Diseases like dysentery, typhoid fever, and cholera, contracted entirely from drinking this rotting swamp water, killed vastly more sailors during this era than all the naval combat, cannon fire, and pirate boarding actions combined. Alcohol solved this horrific logistical problem in two distinct, life-saving ways. First, high-proof alcohol naturally acts as a mild preservative. Rum stored in wooden barrels could last for years in the hold of a ship without spoiling or becoming toxic. Second, and more importantly, when desperate, thirsty sailors mixed their daily ration of rum into their foul, rotting water, The sheer volume of alcohol actually killed off at least some of the deadly bacteria, making the water significantly less likely to cause a fatal case of dysentery. Was it a perfect medical solution? Absolutely not. But in an era long before germ theory was established, before anyone truly understood why the stored water was causing men to violently bleed to death from the inside out, rum was the closest thing to a medical miracle that the maritime world possessed. The British Royal Navy recognized this undeniable logistical reality very early on. In 1655, when the English military successfully captured the massive island of Jamaica from the Spanish Empire, the commanding officer, Vice Admiral William Penn, made a highly calculated bureaucratic decision that would permanently alter naval history for the next 300 years. He officially switched the Royal Navy's daily alcohol ration from expensive French brandy to cheap Jamaican rum. The reasoning was flawlessly logical. Jamaica was now sovereign English territory. The island was producing oceans of cheap, abundant rum. French brandy had to be heavily imported from a hostile, enemy nation at an exorbitant cost. Why pay massive amounts of royal gold for expensive foreign liquor when your newly conquered colony could produce thousands of barrels of Kill Devil for almost nothing? That single, economically driven decision officially turned rum into the lifeblood of the most powerful maritime military force on the face of the earth. Every single British sailor, from the lowest, most abused deckhand to the highest-ranking officers, received an official daily ration of rum. The standard issue was a staggering half-pint of high-proof rum per man per day, an amount of hard liquor that would be considered severe binge drinking by any modern medical standard. This daily ration was eventually mandated to be mixed with water and lime juice to simultaneously prevent the horrific onset of scurvy, creating a legendary naval concoction that became known universally as grog. Chapter 2. The Republic of Intoxication. Pirates, however, were not the Royal Navy. They absolutely did not follow strict naval regulations. They did not answer to highly decorated admirals, and they certainly did not adhere to measured, disciplined rationing. But it is critical to remember that the vast majority of pirates during the Golden Age were former naval sailors, abused merchant seamen, or discharged privateers. They came from the exact same maritime world. They knew the exact same naval traditions, and when they finally snapped, violently mutinied against their tyrannical captains, and went on the account, the period term for turning to piracy, they brought their deep-seated drinking habits directly with them. But on a pirate ship, the culture of rum underwent a massive, terrifying mutation. In the legitimate navies of the world, rum rations were strictly controlled. A designated officer carefully measured out the liquid, and if a sailor was caught drunk while on duty, the punishment was a brutal, flesh-tearing flogging at the mainmast with a cat-o'-nine tails. On a pirate ship, those rules were completely, utterly annihilated. Pirates operated as direct, radical democracies in ways that completely terrified the aristocratic governments of Europe. Pirate crews democratically voted to elect their captains. They drew up highly specific constitutions known as Articles of Agreement, which every single man signed. And when it came to alcohol, the universal, unbending pirate philosophy was terrifyingly simple. Everyone drinks. Everyone drinks exactly as much as they want, and absolutely nobody has the authority to tell another man to stop. This created an unrestrained culture of binge drinking that went far beyond anything occurring on legitimate military or merchant vessels. Pirates did not just casually consume rum, they practically worshipped it. Rum functioned simultaneously as their primary currency, their medicine, their recreation, and their overarching religion. When a heavily armed pirate crew successfully chased down, boarded, and captured a terrified merchant ship, the very first thing they searched for, before they checked the captain's cabin for gold, before they looked for valuable navigation instruments, and before they secured the prisoners, was the ship's liquor supply. Multiple first-hand historical accounts from the Golden Age describe surreal, horrifying scenes of pirates aggressively breaking open the cargo holds of captured ships, discovering massive barrels of rum, and immediately drinking themselves into a state of absolute, unconscious paralysis. completely ignoring the valuable cargo they had just risked their lives to capture. Captain Charles Johnson, whose famous 1724 book, A General History of the Pirates, remains one of the most critical primary sources on the era, described scene after scene of pirates choosing alcohol over basic tactical advantage. In one highly documented instance, a pirate crew captured a massive merchant vessel carrying an absolute fortune in rare silks and expensive spices. But the pirates completely ignored the priceless cargo entirely, favoring several heavy barrels of rum they found hidden in the hold. They drank continuously for 3 straight days, essentially throwing a massive, floating riot, while the incredibly valuable silk sat completely untouched and rotting in the damp hold. But this is where the story of rum and piracy takes its darkest, most clinical turn. Because rum did not just keep pirates alive, it also destroyed them, systematically, predictably, and incredibly violently. The connection between rum and pirate violence is not a romantic adventure trope. It is a clinical, psychological reality. High-proof alcohol aggressively lowers human inhibitions. It severely impairs complex tactical judgment. It rapidly increases aggression and paranoia. And when you combine incredibly heavy, continuous binge drinking with traumatized, uneducated men who already lived entirely outside the laws of civilization, who carried loaded flintlock pistols and heavy cutlasses at all times, and who operated in an isolated environment with zero legal consequences for violence, the results were an absolute catastrophe. Rum became the foundational pillar of the entire pirate economy, acting as the ultimate democratizing force in an era of crushing inequality. When a pirate crew captured a prize, the distribution of the stolen gold followed specific mathematical rules laid out in their articles. The captain and the quartermaster always received double shares. The skilled surgeon and the navigator received a share and a half. The common deckhands received 1 share. But regardless of how the silver, the gold, and the trade goods were mathematically divided, the rum was always, without exception, shared equally among the entire crew. It was considered a fundamental, untouchable human right. A common, uneducated sailor, who received only 1 small coin of gold, still drank the exact same high-quality rum, in the exact same massive quantities as his captain. In a global world defined by brutal kings and oppressed peasants, this equal distribution of alcohol was one of the very few genuinely egalitarian practices that existed on the planet. Furthermore, rum functioned as hard, universally accepted currency in the pirate world. Throughout the Caribbean basin and along the entire American coastline, rum could be traded for absolutely anything. A pirate could trade a barrel of rum for fresh food, new gunpowder, critical ship repairs, vital intelligence, or a safe harbor to hide from the Royal Navy. Corrupt colonial officials happily accepted massive bribes paid in rum. Wealthy, legitimate merchants who would never dare to be seen openly accepting stolen Spanish silver from a known pirate were more than happy to quietly trade supplies for heavy barrels of untraceable spirits. In many lawless ports, rum was vastly more reliable than actual stamped coins because its intrinsic value was consistent, inflation-proof, and universally desired. There is one specific, legendary concoction that captures this intersection of rum and pirate culture better than anything else in history: Bumbo. Bumbo, sometimes spelled Bombo, was the ultimate pirate cocktail. It was a potent mixture of high-proof rum, water, raw sugar, and freshly grated nutmeg. It was essentially a heavily sweetened, spiced, and highly intoxicating version of the Navy's grog, and it was consumed in absolutely staggering quantities across the Caribbean. Bumbo was the undisputed drink of choice in the smoky, dimly lit pirate taverns from Nassau to Port Royal to the lawless island of Tortuga. It was exactly what heavily armed outlaws drank when they came ashore with pockets overflowing with stolen gold. Driven by a desperate, psychological need to completely forget the horrific acts of violence they had committed at sea, and the terrifying reality of the hangman's noose that was inevitably waiting for them. The taverns of Nassau during the brief, explosive era of the Pirate Republic, roughly 1706 to 1718, were legendary for their consumption of rum and bumbo. During this window, Nassau was effectively a sovereign nation governed entirely by pirates. There was absolutely no British colonial authority. The pirates elected their own magistrates, enforced their own brutal outlaw codes, and spent their stolen wealth however they pleased. And what they wanted, overwhelmingly, was to drink until they lost consciousness. Contemporary historical accounts describe Nassau as an absolute nightmare of intoxication. It was a squalid, sun-baked shantytown where heavily armed pirates stumbled through the muddy streets at all hours of the day and night. Vicious, bloody fights broke out constantly over gambling disputes. Men drank until they physically collapsed in the sand, slept for a few hours, woke up, and immediately started drinking again. The entire economic infrastructure of Nassau was built almost exclusively on the pirate trade, and the absolute largest, most profitable sector of that black market economy was the sale of rum. Tavern owners amassed massive fortunes overnight. Local distillers could barely keep the copper stills running fast enough to keep up with the staggering demand. When the British Empire finally decided to crush the Pirate Republic, they sent Woodes Rogers, a highly capable former privateer, as the new royal governor of the Bahamas in 1718. His explicit mission was to clean up the pirate haven, offer pardons to those who surrendered, and hang those who refused. When Rogers stepped ashore in Nassau, one of the very first things he officially recorded in his dispatches back to London was the sheer, astonishing, almost unbelievable amount of alcohol consumption occurring on the island. Rogers offered the king's pardon to any pirate who would lay down their arms and give up the life of crime. Hundreds of desperate pirates accepted the pardon, but even after they were officially forgiven by the crown, the drinking did not stop. Rogers wrote in frustration that the former pirates were orderly enough when sober, but became absolute savages when drunk, which, he noted grimly, was almost all of the time. Chapter 3. The Fatal Hangover. The ultimate tragedy of the golden age of piracy is that the exact same liquid that kept the pirates alive and gave them the courage to terrorize the empires of the world was the exact same substance that systematically orchestrated their downfall. To understand this, we must examine how rum destroyed the greatest captains of the era. Consider the terrifying career of Edward Teach, universally known as Blackbeard. Blackbeard is the most famous, heavily mythologized pirate in human history, and nearly every single primary historical account of his reign of terror heavily features the extreme abuse of alcohol. According to multiple surviving sources, Blackbeard was a chronic, highly functional alcoholic who drank constantly. He recognized the terrifying psychological power of his own reputation, and he used rum to amplify it. He famously mixed raw, explosive gunpowder directly into his cup of rum, ignited it, and drank the flaming, toxic concoction as a terrifying show of absolute dominance over his men. But this continuous, extreme intoxication fueled a deep, violent paranoia. During one infamous drinking session in the captain's cabin, Blackbeard was drinking heavily with his first mate, Israel Hands, and another pirate. Suddenly, without any warning or provocation, Blackbeard blew out the candle, plunging the cabin into darkness. He drew 2 loaded flintlock pistols under the table, crossed his arms, and fired blindly. One of the heavy lead balls shattered Israel Hand's kneecap, permanently crippling the man for the rest of his life. When his shocked, terrified crew later asked him why he had committed such a senseless act of violence against his own loyal officer, Blackbeard coldly reportedly replied that if he did not shoot one of his own men every now and then, they would forget who he was. While this story highlights rum as a tool of terror, other infamous pirate captains were completely, pathetically ruined by it. The pirate crew of Charles Vane, who was one of the most feared and aggressive captains operating in the Caribbean during the early 1700s, essentially self-destructed entirely because of alcohol. Vane's men spent so much time completely incapacitated by rum that their tactical execution became a joke. They repeatedly failed to capture incredibly easy, slow-moving merchant targets because the crew was too drunk to properly man the rigging or fire the cannons accurately. Vane's own leadership became incredibly erratic, cowardly, and unpredictable. behaviors that multiple historical accounts attribute directly to his chronic drinking. Eventually, the crew had enough. They invoked their democratic rights under the Pirate Code, held a vote on the open deck, and officially stripped Charles Vane of his captaincy. They replaced him with his quartermaster, Jack Rackham, better known as Calico Jack, citing Vane's cowardice and alcohol-fueled incompetence as the primary reasons for the mutiny. There was, however, one legendary pirate captain who possessed the intellect to recognize the existential threat that rum posed to his survival. Bartholomew Roberts, also known as Black Bart, was highly unusual among pirates. He preferred drinking hot tea to rum, dressed in immaculate, elaborate silk clothing, and insisted on strict, almost military-level discipline aboard his ships. When Roberts drafted his specific articles of agreement, the pirate code that every single crew member was required to sign, he included highly specific, heavily enforced rules regarding drinking. His code explicitly mandated that all lights, candles, and lanterns below decks had to be extinguished exactly at 8 p.m. If any man wished to continue drinking rum after that hour, he was legally required to do it on the open, freezing upper deck, where his behavior could be closely monitored to prevent drunken brawls, mutiny, or accidental fires. Roberts deeply understood a fundamental, undeniable truth of maritime warfare. A drunk crew was a dead crew. And Roberts was absolutely right. His piracy career lasted significantly longer and was vastly more successful than almost any other pirate of the Golden Age. He captured an astonishing total of over 400 ships. He terrorized massive shipping lanes stretching all the way from the Caribbean basin across the Atlantic to the coast of West Africa. He maintained absolute discipline in a profession where discipline was almost entirely non-existent. While it wasn't the only factor, historians universally agree that his strict prohibition on unrestrained drinking was a massive component of his terrifying effectiveness as a military commander. Compare the incredible success of Bartholomew Roberts to the pathetic, doomed fate of Stede Bonnet, famously known as the Gentleman Pirate. Bonnet was a wealthy, highly educated Barbados sugar plantation owner who, inexplicably, abandoned his comfortable, aristocratic life, purchased a ship, and decided to become a pirate. By absolutely all historical accounts, he was catastrophically terrible at it. He knew absolutely nothing about sailing, navigation, or naval combat, and multiple historical sources strongly suggest that he relied incredibly heavily on rum just to cope with the sheer psychological stress and paralyzing fear of his new, violent career. Under the constant influence of alcohol, Bonnet's judgment rapidly deteriorated. His crew quickly lost all confidence in his leadership. He was eventually captured by pirate hunters, put on trial, and hanged in Charleston, South Carolina in 1718. The official court records describe a man who appeared deeply confused, weeping, and completely broken, a far, tragic cry from the wealthy gentleman who had set out to sea just 2 years earlier. But the darkest, most horrifying layer of the rum story goes far beyond pirate mutinies and tavern brawls. The endless oceans of rum that the pirates drank so freely, the liquid that they celebrated as the ultimate symbol of their absolute freedom, was produced entirely by the blood, sweat, and agony of enslaved human beings. The entire sugar and rum economy of the Caribbean was structurally built upon the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade. Enslaved Africans were kidnapped, packed into the suffocating holds of massive ships, and brought to the islands by the hundreds of thousands to work the sugar plantations. They were forced to plant the cane, harvest it with heavy machetes in the sweltering heat, operate the dangerous boiling sugar vats, and run the distillation stills. Rum was in fact one of the central, driving commodities in the infamous triangular trade that connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Ships carried manufactured goods and weapons from Europe down to West Africa, where they were traded to warlords for enslaved people. The enslaved people were then transported across the brutal Middle Passage to the Caribbean, where they were sold at auction to plantation owners. The plantations utilized this enslaved labor to produce sugar and rum, which were then shipped back up to Europe and the American colonies, completing the massive, highly profitable, blood-soaked triangle. When pirates captured a ship carrying rum and drank that rum to celebrate their defiance of the law, they were consuming a product absolutely saturated in human suffering. The profound irony is staggering. Pirates, who fiercely portrayed themselves as free men escaping the crushing tyranny of the British Navy and the wealthy aristocrats, were entirely dependent on an economic system built upon the most extreme, brutal form of human bondage ever devised. The absolute freedom the pirates celebrated with every cup of bumbo was made mathematically possible only by the enslavement of others. As the golden age of piracy dragged into the 1720s, the fatal consequences of the rum culture finally caught up with the outlaws. Rum was not just a drink. It was embedded deep into the rituals of pirate justice and execution. When a pirate was found guilty of a severe crime against the crew, such as stealing from the communal treasure chest, the punishment was often marooning. The condemned man was forcefully rowed to a tiny, barren, waterless sandbar in the middle of the ocean. He was left with exactly 3 items: a loaded pistol, a bottle of water, and a bottle of rum. The rum was not an act of generosity. It was an act of calculated, psychological cruelty. A man stranded on a blistering, deserted island with no hope of rescue would inevitably drink the rum. He would briefly experience the warmth of intoxication, and then, as the brutal hangover set in under the unforgiving tropical sun, he would face the full, unvarnished horror of his impending death by dehydration, completely sober and alone. The pistol was provided so he could put a bullet in his own brain before the agony of thirst drove him insane. The tradition of rum also heavily dictated the way pirates died at the hands of the law. Captured pirates awaiting execution in dark, stone colonial jails were typically given access to as much rum as they desired in the days leading up to their hanging. This was partially a practical measure by the guards. Drunk, lethargic prisoners were much easier to manage than sober, desperate, terrified ones, but it was also viewed as a form of dark, maritime mercy. If you were destined to swing from the end of a rope, you might as well be numb to the terror when the floor dropped out from under you. There are numerous recorded historical instances of pirates walking up the wooden steps of the gallows, visibly, heavily intoxicated. The famous pirate William Fly, who was executed in Boston in 1726, reportedly cursed the executioner for his poor knot-tying skills and shouted defiantly at the massive crowd, all while swaying heavily on his feet from the massive amounts of alcohol he had consumed. Calico Jack Rackham was reportedly completely drunk when his ship was finally captured by pirate hunters, and he was heavily intoxicated again when he was publicly hanged in Port Royal. His body later tarred and hung in an iron cage as a warning to others. The ultimate irony is that rum, the very substance that made pirates brave enough to attack heavily armed galleons and physically strong enough to endure the brutal conditions of the sea, was exactly the substance that made them careless enough to be exterminated. The golden age of piracy did not end because the European navies suddenly invented vastly superior cannons, or because merchant ships suddenly became invincible. It ended largely because the colonial governments finally got serious about law enforcement, and heavily armed enforcement is incredibly effective when your targets are completely incapacitated. Pirate crews were at their absolute most vulnerable when they were anchored in port, and they were almost always blindly drunk in port. The Royal Navy began executing highly coordinated surprise raids on pirate taverns and coastal hideouts at the crack of dawn. They captured dozens of notorious pirates who were simply too hungover or intoxicated to find their weapons, let alone coordinate a defense. Ships that possessed the aerodynamic speed to easily outrun pursuing naval vessels were captured because their crews were too drunk to properly rig the sails. Lookouts in the crow's nest, who should have spotted the white sails of approaching warships miles away on the horizon, were passed out from bumbo. Again and again, the historical archives reveal that the most feared pirates on Earth were captured not through brilliant naval tactics, but through their own alcohol-fueled negligence. The death of Blackbeard is the ultimate testament to this fact. When Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy finally cornered Blackbeard anchored at Ocracoke Island in November 1718, Blackbeard's crew had been drinking heavily and partying the entire night before. Multiple historical accounts confirm that when Maynard launched his surprise attack at dawn, A massive portion of Blackbeard's men were severely hungover or still actively drunk. The resulting battle on the blood-slicked decks was vicious, chaotic, and incredibly violent. Blackbeard himself fought with the ferocity of a cornered demon, sustaining 5 point-blank gunshot wounds and over 20 deep sword cuts before he finally bled to death on the deck. But his crew's deeply impaired, intoxicated state made the fight vastly more lopsided than it should have been. The greatest pirate of the age was ultimately betrayed by the very poison he had used to build his myth.
Rum outlasted the pirates who loved it. Long after the Golden Age was violently crushed, long after the last pirate crews were hunted down, captured, and their bodies left to rot in iron cages over the Thames, rum remained the undisputed drink of the sea. The British Royal Navy continued issuing the daily rum ration to its sailors for centuries, an unbroken military tradition that did not finally end until July 31, 1970, a day mourned by British sailors as Black Tot Day. The story of rum and piracy is the story of the entire colonial Caribbean compressed into a single burning liquid. It contains within it the absolute brutality of the slave plantation system, the sheer desperation of abused men living completely outside the law, the cold economics of global imperial trade, the dark psychology of addiction, and the extreme violence of an era when the rules of polite civilization instantly dissolved the second a ship lost sight of land. Every single heavy wooden barrel of rum that crossed the Caribbean carried all of that dark history with it. The drink was rough enough to make grown men weep, and the men who drank it were always running from something, whether it was crushing poverty, the tyrannical lash of the Royal Navy, the hangman's noose, or the ghosts of their own violent pasts. Rum did not judge them. Rum simply burned going down, and for a few fleeting hours in the dark, it made the terrifying, overwhelming world feel small, manageable, and safe. For the pirates of the Caribbean, forgetfulness was the most valuable treasure they ever captured, and in the end, it cost them absolutely everything. If this dark dive into the true history of the high seas kept you watching, hit that subscribe button. I cover the hidden, gritty history behind everything the sea touched, from the ships to the storms to the men who sailed through both. Drop a comment below and tell us which notorious pirate or lost maritime mystery we should expose next. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon.